Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Earthly Headlines. Today I want to talk about ancient cities. This one in particular is the Viking city of Ribe, and apparently the city was one of the first of its kind in terms of something that resembles a more modern city in a sense of how it worked, in terms of trade networks and how the residents came to become permanent residents, and its importance in the rise of the Vikings and how the Viking legend kind of unfolded. Ribe was one of the first cities that was instrumental in making the Vikings the powerhouse that they were. So just as a quick background, the Romans were pretty much running everything until about 480 around there, and then from there there was something called the migration period, which basically the Romans just dropped everything and went back to where they came from, and the barbarian tribes came in and they just sort of settled, and there was some infighting among them, but for the most part they occupied the rest of the lands. Like I did a video on the Alemanni tribe. They were one of the many tribes. There were the Franks, the Vandals, even the nomadic Huns. All these groups, they came and settled these areas up until about the Viking Age, around 750, 800, early 800 AD is when things really started cracking for the Vikings. And if you ever read Beowulf was written around this time as well. One of the first complete works ever. I would recommend reading it. It's a pretty good book. I read it twice. I read it in high school, and then I read it in college again. Anyway, so this article comes from Science Nordic, and it's a very recent article, and they found a bunch of stuff there, which it is an important part of this article. But what I want to get into is the actual role Ribe had in its setup, how it got going, and why it was so important to the Viking, empire. Ribe is in West Denmark, or at the time it was called Jutland. I think it's still called Jutland, that region. And these archaeologists from Aarhus University and these scholars from the museums there as well, they were excavating they had a really planned out, really careful excavation plan. They were part of what's called the Northern Emporium project, which kind of oversaw all of these excavations. And what they did was they dug down 3 meters below the street level, and then they found traces of the first cities of the Nordic region. So they found jewelry like beads, amulets, coins, combs, and then bones, stuff like that. They discovered more odd stuff like a lyre, which is like a harp instrument, and then it had tuning pegs. They found dog poop, like domesticated dog poop. A lot of other evidence that supported the written documentation that Ribe was a trade city, and a very successful trade city. And they found, they found runic inscriptions and stuff like that. So the people who lived here, it wasn't your normal run-of-the-mill in town. They weren't just farmers. These were craftsmen, tradesmen, innkeepers, musicians, not pirates, but seafarers. Remember, because this city is it's right next to the ocean. It's a coastal city. And up until this point, they've known a lot about Ribe. They knew that it existed. I think the first documentation was like 850 AD, but in that documentation they referred back to it even further. So it was in that document, it said that it was founded around 810, like 10 years after the turn of the century. So these scholars, the modern day scholars, got it into their minds that, okay, there's probably more to this city than just what's written. So let's just dig. So layer by layer, they studied this early period of the city. The problem was, they had started this years ago, but it cost a lot of money, but then they got more funding, and then it became a bigger excavation. Now they found a bunch of stuff. So some of the new methods they used were 3D laser surveying, which they didn't have before, DNA research, checking the chemistry of the soil, and which all kind of extracted new information. They call it high definition methods. So let's talk about the early part of Ribe. So the city was established in a part of the world where no one had ever lived. So it kind of reminds me of Los Angeles, because if you look at the graphical location of LA, yeah, we're close to the ocean, but it's in a desert. It's a chaparral technically, but that basically means it's land turning into desert. So if you were a farmer or anything like that, you probably wouldn't live here. So what draws people to LA are the trade networks, essentially, and business opportunities. And that's basically what Ribe was. It was very, very successful as well. So it started out from the earlier excavations that it was a seasonal market town for a few generations. So people would go there during like when it was nice. They would trade and sell their goods and then go back to where they came from. It wasn't until later that they started to settle there more permanently. And here's a 3D scan of the layers of the flooring of the city. So, I think this is one of the houses actually. Yeah. So that's kind of a visual you could pause and take a look at. So, how do they know that they were settled there more? How do they know that it became a more permanent settlement rather than just a seasonal marketplace? Well, they found solid houses that existed a few years after the earliest activities in the area. So about 720 AD. So this is when residents started coming in, traders and craftsmen in the area, and it started becoming an urban community around this time. I basically word of mouth got out, more and more people came, and then instead of coming and going, a few people just decided, hey, we're just gonna set up a shop here permanently, and then that's what happened, and more and more people just ended up doing that. So the other odd thing about Ribe was ancient cities, especially in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, they were kind of close. A lot of these big cities were close to each other, and they were close to temples and palaces and city walls and stuff. Ribe wasn't like that. It was really far away from the next closest city, which was like hundreds of kilometers apart. So miles and miles and miles away were the next city. So this is kind of like on an island almost. Kind of like with my LA analogy earlier. Now LA it's you can't even call it LA anymore. You got to call it like the greater Los Angeles area. It's just a sprawling city now, but in its heyday it wasn't like that. Same thing with this city. It's evident that people visited the city from far away. It was a city that lived by its networks, like I mentioned before. Networks of trade and information were crucial to city life throughout history, but it is a lot harder to observe networks in archaeological excavations, obviously, because, networks are an abstract thing. It's not a thing that you can dig up. At least it's not obvious anyway. One thing that Ribe did have were there were layers to the city. So once they dug in deep enough, there were even more parts of the city that had not been touched at all. They could reliably date the city basically decade by decade because of this, and coupled with their high definition methodology of analyzing the site. Part of the reason why Ribe was so instrumental in the rise of the Vikings was because it was an ideal departure point for sailing ships. And a lot of seafarers would come through that area just so they could launch to other parts of the Nordic area. So around 700 AD, maritime traffic in the North Sea was in its infancy. But 100 years later, when the Viking Age is traditionally said to have begun, the sailing ship had its breakthrough in the north. So about 700 AD were about the early adopters of developing the maritime trade. But 800 is when things started to pop off. Commercial cities like Ribe, with their extensive networks, were crucial in the sailing revolution as the ships were used to trade cities' goods. And with the rest of Scandinavia, we see this change in the remains of workshops. The workshops meaning they would check the workshop, they would excavate a workshop, and then they could get a closer look at the lives of the people who actually live there. There would be the reason why they know there's a network here is because of the sheer of craftsmen and merchants living there. They wouldn't just live there. They're selling goods. They're not making everything in house there. The only reason why we would think they're making stuff in house is if they're coming and then leaving, like in the early days when it started. But since they're living there full time and they're still able to sell and trade, that means they're sourcing material from somewhere else. That's one of the clues as to how they know that they had some trade networks, among other. I'm not including the other evidence of it being a port city and a common launch point for seafarers. So they found, after digging and digging, they found ironsmiths, amber workers, leather workers, comb makers, jewelers, and they all worked with pewter, lead, copper, alloy, silver, and gold. And in the beginning, they used local supplies such as antlers from stags, right? I'm talking about the comb makers here. And then, however, they could see the change as time passed, that from 800 onward, they started using antlers from reindeer, which was imported from Norway. So they changed their source from locally grown and locally hunted stuff to trading for it in Norway, which is interesting. It's a very interesting observation. Same thing with bead makers. The oldest layers were evidence of small workshops, each only in use for days or weeks, and then they would leave and then come back and set up shop again and do it all over. And then the raw material must have originated far from Ribe, and it's clear that each craftsman brought a slightly different range of colors. And then, for a few generations it's like this, and then the production stops around 800 AD again. In its place were mass-produced beads from the Middle East, and they started arriving in bulk. So again, that's another clue that these are like the precursors to globalization almost. They're starting to source stuff outside the country, and people must have gotten really rich from this. Here's a piece of I think this is wood. This is a harp with the tuning pegs. Yeah, I think it's made out of wood. Yeah, it looks like it's made out of wood. A lot of other gemstones they got were looted from Roman graves, and remember the Romans were occupying this area for a while, and then they just up and left, and they just left everything. And so a lot of that meant gold, silver, all kinds of precious jewels, and they just they dug up the graves and they plundered their burials, and they refurbished them into other things. So that there's also evidence of that as well. The findings show that the first city of the north appeared before trade with the Mediterranean and Middle East was established. It was another network that kick-started the development of Ribe, and then they're going to continue excavation and find out more. Many of the most important results are probably yet to come. So all in all, the Project Northern Emporium has excavated about 100 square meters of cultural layers in the heart of the oldest Ribe. Future development and field methods will include geochemical element analysis, micromorphology, and dynamic electronic methods for documenting the excavation. So they're planning on not only excavating the area, but they're going to use new experimental and cutting-edge methods to even find out potentially of what was going on back then. So I guess in conclusion that this is probably a great example of a city starting out the way it did as a seasonal spot, and then it just blowing up into a full-blown city, a city of commerce, basically. There are probably way more cities like this. This is probably one of many. And it seems like the Vikings really did have a global, almost, well, in their turn, in those days, global network with Western Europe, as far as the Middle East, and probably even a little bit further, even further west too. There's Iceland. We did the Eric the Red episode. Probably evidence in North America as well, because there is some evidence that the Vikings did reach, I think, Newfoundland on the east coast of modern United States and Canada, that area, and they were trading with the natives there, or at least they had some sort of contact with them. So what do you guys think about this? Did you guys know? Does this kind of alter your view of the Vikings as just some marauding, roaming band of barbarians, or do you think this kind of civilizes them more and makes them shines a new light on them? Maybe they weren't as bloodthirsty berserkers that they're made out to be. I think these guys are savvy businessmen as well. I mean, aside from the looting and plundering, burials, and taking that, I mean, that you can look at that one way, I guess. But I guess to them that was just an opportunity to make money, and you got to respect that, right? Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.